p.m. My name is Scott Sherrill. I'm a senior planner here with the City of Concord. My principal responsibility with the city is serving as a staff member to the Historic Preservation Commission. And this presentation that you're about to hear is really an initiative that was born out of the Historic Preservation Commission as part of a larger preservation plan where we're looking at historic resources that are outside of what we normally think of within our local historic districts here of North and South Union Street. We recognize that Concord has a broader and richer history that hasn't necessarily been looked at yet. There is some previous work that have been done which sort of serve to help place this project in context both for the city and in terms of how it is shaped. The first is the Historic Architecture of Cabarrus County, North Carolina, which was a very broad, high-level survey completed in the late 1970s and early 1980s by Peter Kaplan that took a very, sort of hit the high notes of preservation at that time. And then next to that, you would see a detailed district survey, which we have for North and South Union, where a surveyor went door to door and documented all the architectural characteristics. Like I mentioned, the work that Laura's done for the city as part of the preservation plan is somewhere in the middle. It takes a look at neighborhoods, identifying those that are possible for future National Register listings, those that are possible for some local recognition, and selecting a few resources from each that are really representative of those communities for a high level look, but recognizing that it's not as detailed as going door to door within each of the neighborhoods that she looked at. So Laura Purvis, I've mentioned a few times, is our consultant. She works with CRA Incorporated. She's based in Richmond, Virginia. She's an architectural historian, and she's really the star of our show this afternoon. To give you some further guidance in terms of the context of where we are in the project overall, we did citizen engagement, some public input surveys back in the spring. Laura was here in March and April to do the architectural surveys. So next we're going to be finishing up drafting, and we hope to move into the approval process for the documents between the Historic Commission and City Council coming into this winter around the turn of the year. With that, I'll get out of the way and let Laura explain to you what she found in her architectural review.
Scott, thank you for that introduction. I want to say hi to everyone. My name is Laura Purvis again. I work for Cultural Resource Analyst based out of Richmond, Virginia. And I'm really, really excited to be here this afternoon to be able to share with you the results of the study and kind of go through some of the things that we found, some of the themes that we discovered, and some of the recommendations that we found in the process of doing this work. And the other thing is that I want to encourage you all to ask questions. There's going to be a question and answer session at the end, but if there's something that you have a burning question about in the process of me going through this, please let me know. I'm happy to answer questions and kind of go through anything that is of particular interest to you all. And again, thank you for the time to be here today for the presentation. So, structure of what we're going to be talking about today. So we've already done introductions, got that checked off. I'm going to give you an overview of the project, the method that we were using to get this work done, because again, this is a lot of neighborhoods that we were looking at, a lot of resources, and then also some of the goals that were established at the outset of the process. Then talk a little bit about fieldwork. How do I do that? What am I doing? I'm driving around in a car, taking photos, talking to people. How does that all work? And then we're going to look through a select set of the neighborhoods. There are 28 of them total. So rather than go through each and every one, I'm going to give kind of an overview, a sample of the neighborhoods, and then if there's other ones that we don't cover in the process of the talk today, we can go into more detail with those during questions and things like that. And then also they're going to the recommendations that were made. So after all of this come back together, what are the things that we walked away with as far as next steps? And then, of course, questions. So, methods. At the outset, we established a list of neighborhoods working with the city. These were neighborhoods that maybe hadn't been previously looked at. Maybe there were some things that we need to go back and re-identify in the neighborhood. Maybe we need to look at the historic boundaries of the neighborhood and make sure that those boundaries that have been looked at in the late 1970s, early 1980s, or even in the to the 2000s when there was another study, make sure that those are still intact. Because one of the things with kind of these historic neighborhoods is looking at what is the new construction and how does that impact the historic development. And then one of the other things is to bolster the representation of the mill villages that are such an important part of Concord's history, and then of course African American history as well. Really make sure that those neighborhoods, community centers are an important piece of what we're surveying. So once we got that list, then we look at surveying each neighborhood, and then trying to pull out, as Scott mentioned, those individual resources that kind of give a little bit of a summary of what the characteristics of that neighborhood are. So that means I go around and take a lot of pictures, and then I kind of hone that down to 3, 4, 5, maybe a few more, to then put in the report as examples of what is typical. And so that's where the really significant difference of this kind of study versus the intensive kind of study that a National Register nomination where you're going door to door, making sure that you're talking to each and every property owner and that kind of thing. So that's why this is a very different kind of initial study to get an idea of context, essentially, historic context and characteristics. And the other task was to make sure that we weren't duplicating previous survey in a way that wasn't going to move the study forward. So there had been a lot of work done in the Union Street area. There had been some other things that had been researched, and so we didn't want to go back and look at areas that maybe didn't need that additional look right at this particular moment. And so taking that into account as well. And then, of course, provide recommendations on districts, confirming boundaries, like I already said. And then within the parameters of these neighborhoods, we looked at a chunk of individual properties, and that would be a total of 120 individual properties. And those are distributed throughout the neighborhoods, and some of them are outside if they were of particular importance, or they were kind of standalone buildings that needed some consideration and things like that. So it's trying to balance all those different bits and pieces, because it really had been quite some time since there had been this kind of holistic look at the city boundaries as well. So. All right, so what are the current conditions, right? Starting point for the survey. So we have this. Concord has local districts. So this is separate from state and national recognition. These are locally designated districts, and you can see those outlined in the map behind me. We've got the North Union Street Local Historic District, Edgewood Local Historic District. Then there's a couple of individual property, or 4 actually, that you can see throughout. And then you've got the South Union Local Historic District. So again, this is only local. Now, some of them overlap with the state and national recognition, but that's a different kind of recognition. Okay, and then we've got the National Register of Historic Places districts. Those are the ones that have gone through the state and federal process to be recognized. And so that's the Mill Historic District, Odell, Locke, Randolph Mill. Then you've got North Union Street Historic District, so you're seeing there's some overlap between these. And then you have Barbara Scotia College, and then there are several districts along the North Union Street corridor because of the way that they were nominated. They were nominated at different times, so even though you think of it as kind of a holistic corridor, there's actually bits and pieces that are part of different nominations. And so you can actually go and look those up online. They're available for you to read. And they were nominated at different points from about the 1980s up through into 2000s. And so then you've got the Coleman Franklin Cannon Mill, and then you've also got the Stonewall Jackson Training School. So that's farther south, of course. So to dig a little bit more into the differences between the districts that we're looking at. So you have the National Register, which is what I just showed you. That's recognized at both the state level and through the National Park Service. So that's a set step system. Records are kept with the keeper of the register, which is a federal employee that keeps those records, and then also at the State Historic Preservation Office. The nomination forms are available online, and it's eligible for supporting programs that are administered both through the state and the federal government, and there's a bunch of different ones. Now, in North Carolina, there's a thing called the study list that is really established as a system for looking at properties prior to that national recognition. Okay. The study list is really helpful in informing what I do, because I can look and see, well, there have been researchers that have come before me that, okay, this area is really important and gone through a state process to have it study listed, but it's not yet recognized at the federal level. Okay. So, as it says in the list, it's reviewed by the State Historic Preservation Office, and it also can be viewed on the state's Historic Preservation web service. So you can go online and look at the data for this. So it is available. It's something that the public can access, but it's just not the same kind of access as the National Register nomination. So does that kind of make sense? It's a little, there's a lot of process to this. So those study listed districts, there's a lot more of those in Concord because they did a whole bunch of research. They said, hey, we're going to move forward with a few of them, and then there were a lot that made it to the study listed stage. They're not registered on the national level yet. And so those are everything in red that's behind me. So you've got the Brown Norcutt manufacturing area and the village associated with that. You've got an expansion of South Union Street. There's some areas of North Union Street that were an expansion, and then Gibson Manufacturing Company and the Mill Village associated with that. And then there's actually the Mill Village associated with Odell Block as well. And then there's a couple of individual properties as well. And then, of course, the Cannon Mill District, and then there's another Cannon housing district as well. So there's a bunch of bits and pieces that remain as recommendations that just haven't moved forward in the process. So these are the things that I looked at to say, okay, are the boundaries still okay? Are there things that I can make sure that there hasn't been too much development to where those recommendations that were made in the past maybe don't hold up to what the state and the feds expect? So that's why we were revisiting some of those sites. All right, so field mapping. So I've got all this information. Now what do I do to get it all organized so that I can drive around and actually look at everything? So here is a representation of all the neighborhoods that we looked at with their rough boundaries. Okay, so one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is what are the historic boundaries versus what the city has designated. And you can see all 28 listed there. And there's a kind of a core that you can see around Union Street, kind of north-south, expanding out from that into what was known as West Concord, more generally in the area of like around Norcutt and stuff like that, historically. And so the pink dots, which this gets real messy, but just to show you for reference, the dots that have letters and numbers associated with them are the things that I actually went out and took photos of and surveyed. So that shows you within each neighborhood what we looked at to try to figure out where is the historic core? Are there any things that are representative? What's going on? So then the other thing that I'm trying to figure out is when did stuff grow? When did things get built? And so we use the county or city assessor records to go back and plot essentially what are the construction dates of the buildings as the best that we know. So this is the representation of the 19th century and then 20th century. So you can see this kind of explosive change, right? And Concord is still going through this like rapid growth cycle. So one of the things that we're dealing with in historic preservation is, okay, how do you account for that? And some of this way that we're doing selective survey to do planning is in response to the way that things develop over time. So yeah. Any questions before I move on? Awesome. All right. So then we looked at 28 neighborhoods. And so now I'm going to go through some of the individual characteristics of some of them just to give you an idea of the breadth of what we were looking at. So for example, Beverly Hills, an example of a mid-20th century neighborhood, still relatively intact. Construction largely from 1950 to 1970, platted in 1948 by Journey Sides and Albert Palmer. As with a lot of 20th century neighborhoods, you get a lot of ranch houses, long single-story buildings. There are some commercial and community structures associated with the neighborhood on the edges, of course, the elementary school that's there. And this was one that had the potential to be a district. There's not a ton of infill development. There's still the streets and the landscaping that is kind of indicative of how it was originally platted. And so what you can see in the image is the plat of Beverly Hills in that first phase. The streetscapes, kind of curving, very typical of your modern or mid-20th century automobile-centric neighborhood. You needed a car to get places. Now, moving earlier, we have Brookwood. Brookwood is located east of the Odell Locke Randolph Mill Complex. It was developed on the former McDonald farm, 140 acres of it. And the McDonalds were heavily involved in the mill, owned it for a little while. The son came in and worked there. There's a lot going on in that period. And the neighborhood really expanded in response to that kind of turn of the 20th century mill growth that occurred throughout Concord. So we see these kind of booms in neighborhood development in Concord. One of them is around this mill growth period. And so this neighborhood had bits and pieces where there was some new development that happened, some demolitions and things like that. So this is one that Rose recommended for additional study, to go out and count the resources and make sure there's a core that could stand as a historic district. Because again, in this initial survey, we're trying to get a sense of, what's there. So the other thing that's pretty cool is that one of the things that I had at my disposal was a ton of newspaper articles, which were really fantastic in getting a sense of history, getting a sense of who was doing what, things like that. So this is actually an advertisement for Brookwood where they were auctioning off lots. And this is something that you see a lot. And apparently they got a little bit testy about auctioning off some of this, because the auctioneer kind of warned, I'm not going to walk you around to every single lot. You're just going to have to show up and then figure it out, essentially. And sometimes they entice people with, prizes and bands, and it was quite the event, apparently. And this gives you an idea of an early aerial photograph of Brookwood, and this is one of the things that, again, I used. The actual properties that I surveyed are the ones that have those numbers, and that's a state-assigned number. That's why that's on there. And if you go and look at the report that we generated, you can match those numbers with the property. And then one of the things that these aerials are really fantastic with is looking at development over time. And so some of them were from the 1930s, and this is one of those ones from that period. So I can figure out what happened prior to growth after World War II. Yes, question?
Do you have an estimate of what the actual cost per acre was at that time?
I'm sorry?
Cost per acre.
Cost per acre. That's a great question, and I have it in my notes, but I don't have it in my head. I don't know if they list it on here. I will find out. And come afterwards and let me get your contact information, and I can give that to you. Yeah. And so one of the other things with Brookwood is looking at what could be mill housing, what could not be, what are the different periods of development, because there were different things going on in the area, and you see some different housing types as a result. So the picture that I have here is one of those kind of standard housing types that you see: one story, the roof, what's called a side gable roof. The roof line is facing the street, enclosed with a fence. All of those things that are very typical of that type of housing. So another community, Brown's Farm. This is down a little bit farther off of Old Charlotte Road. And this is one of those neighborhoods that was developed on a farm site rather quickly, 1959 to 1969, and had a concentration of very small, modest homes known as minimal traditional. One story, kind of smaller housing. And again, you can see a trend. This was platted in 1948, right? You're getting just, there are these things that are happening, post-World War II, as more people are coming, wanting housing and things like that. You begin to see farmland flipping. And this was originally known as the Brown Brothers Farm, so thus Brown's Farm is the name of the neighborhood. And then this also incorporates some of the auto services and things like that that Old Charlotte Road was known for at that time. It was, definitely a corridor for that. And then we brought Brown Norcutt. Now you see the development date for this is quite long, 1905 to 1986. Well, what I'm trying to do is to cut off the period where we see a lot of infill happening, so cutting it to the point of continued growth. Even though there's some development and change, this is a really intact example. So this is one of those communities that was on that study list, right? Hadn't moved forward into the National Register evaluation phase yet. But going back, it still checks all the boxes. It still has everything that really we look for as far as an intact community that has housing types, the buildings, the mill buildings are still there, all of those things. And one thing I will say about mill complexes, just for information's sake, is that mill villages don't necessarily have to have the mill intact to be National Register eligible. If it's a really good example of housing, if there's things that are still intact about streets and things like that, completely losing the mill isn't necessarily going to kick it out immediately. So this area of Concord, when it was developed, was just outside, was a little bit west, and it was known as Missouri City. R.A. Brown, who developed the mill in a partnership, his wife was named Missouri, so he named it after his wife. And you'll see these names start to show up as you're doing this research. You're like, oh, well, they were doing this here, and then the other ones were developing it over here, and you start seeing themes with that. And so then Charles Johnson, who was also one of the original partners working with Brown, then develops Norcutt a decade later. So you get these, back and forth kind of things as this turn of the century mill growth is happening. So you see this in bunches of different parts of town, this growth period. There were residential lot auctions again, just like we saw in Brookwood. They're trying to get rid of this stuff, throw it out, see what happens. And then there's also an intact commercial row here, which is really important and something that Concord is really distinctive for, is that you get these commercial districts that are still associated with the mill complexes. And so then this was one that said, yeah, this is study listed. It still has the intact characteristics that we're looking for in architectural history lingo. It's called integrity. Yeah, let's move forward with that. So. Now, another one that didn't quite stay so intact is the Brownville Winecoff Hills area. Okay, so this is a little bit farther south off of Union Street. And Missouri Brown shows up again. So she owns some land that is known and platted as Brownville in 1814. Not super populated. And there's a few houses there. There's some things that got developed early on. You get some craftsman houses, which have these big porches on them. You get some Tudor Revival things that have, really decorative English-looking stuff. But there's not a lot that really you could really say is a distinct neighborhood separate from what's going on in Union Street. Well, then the Weinkauf family begins to separate out their land too. And they separate out their land, and then more of that development happens, say, after World War II. As more development pressure is happening, you get more automobiles in the area, it's a thing. And so that neighborhood, because of the styles being so different, the development periods being so different, it really doesn't hold together in the way that we look for as far as a district goes. So there's some really cool houses there. There's things that we can talk about, but it doesn't hold up necessarily as a historic district from the perspective of what we're looking at. Okay. So Cabarrus East and Mount Vernon Heights, another neighborhood related to mill development, but not quite as active as some of the other ones that we've already looked at. Early development, 1880s to 1940, and then there's some additions into the 1970s off to the east. So originally there's this kind of concentration of development because it's so close to current downtown Concord. There's the mine that's there originally, very close by. And so then in 1898, the Lippert Shealy Manufacturing Company starts up there, the mill that's there. Then by 1904, there's a bunch of changes that happen, and then Odell comes in, and he starts running the mill as that expansion period is taking place. And then by 1918, it switches again. So there's a lot of off and on with this particular property. And then it becomes another mill. It was a yarn mill at that time. So as that is happening, then you get the neighborhood development that's kind of over to the east of that. If you're looking where the actual label is, it says, let's see, where is it? Yeah, the label that says Cabarrus Avenue. That's actually where more of the Mount Vernon Heights area is. And it was platted, and like many of these neighborhoods, you get a plat in like the 19-teens, 1920s, but then things slow down. The Depression hits, stuff like that. And then post-World War II, people take advantage of those platted neighborhoods to then develop them. And so the growth that you see is more related to the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, rather than that original plat. And so that's why you see these two very different characteristics in that area. You got some mill growth, and then you've got the stuff that happened after the 1940s. So there's that. And looking at this, there's some more research that could be done here, but again, looking at it, it has such a spread in growth that it's hard to say that would be necessarily that entire area would be an intact district, historic district. So City View. City View is, let's see, it's located near the Norcutt area where the traffic circle is now, and near Old Campground Cemetery. And this is one of those neighborhoods platted in the 1920s, grew throughout, were a decent number of houses there, and then there was so much change that there's not as many historic houses there now. So it was platted by Dixie Realty and Insurance Company and Reese Long, who's a name that shows up again and again in records. By 1936, there are 70 houses. That's a lot for this kind of area. But as things trail off, and then there's a lot of development that comes in the 21st century, this doesn't really have as many old houses anymore. And so that's one of the better examples of how change over time can impact the way that we look at a neighborhood and the more recent growth that has happened. So. Coleman, Franklin, Cannon, Mill Village. Well, the mill is already National Register property. Got that down. But there's some things that are really interesting about the Mill Village surrounding it. I have a date range of 1925 to 1960s. That's a little bit conservative. There might be things that are earlier than that, but it's going to require more research. So this is one of those ones that I really recommended to look at. Are there any houses left from that early Coleman mill phase? Generally right now, we're not sure. Just waiting to find out and try to see what's going to be, there's a lot of deed work that needs to be done to try to figure that out. But there are some really significant records that we have. For example, there was a newspaper article that came out about a man who was working at the mill during the Coleman period. African-American gentleman had built his house there, and fire happened right in his home. And because this was so far outside of Concord, which is interesting to think about, the fire services couldn't get there in time to put out the fire in time to save his house. Now, there's a lot of different interpretations of that story, of course, but the point remains that this was considered very outside of Concord. It was kind of removed from that core. It was in an area where there weren't as many, mill complexes, and so they needed to have housing in this area. You could walk from Logan community, but it would be a little bit of a trek. There was a bridge or a pass-through, basically, that you can see on aerials where people were walking across the train tracks at that point in time. So there's more work to be done there as far as the history, looking at also the residential expansion that happened after Cannon purchased it, and then the history following that as well. So. Looking at Corbin East, this is another neighborhood where you're looking expansion out from the core of downtown Concord, the 1880s through the 1960s. Corbin East goes through a lot of different changes in names, so if you're doing some research, Mount Pleasant Road, Fayetteville Road, Corbin Avenue with an A. And this was one of those areas that developed over time and was converted farmland. Again, kind of something that we see happening over time pretty regularly. This corridor had both residential and business uses on it. So there were some, greenhouse type activities that were taking place in the area and things like that. And then because it was such a significant corridor for access to downtown, we see records of it being paved, which is something that is pretty important in the development of the city, to have that infrastructure where you get a paved road instead of dirt packed earth kind of thing, or something that has gravel on it. This was also one of the areas where education was kind of a central focus of this corridor, because the East Corbin Street School, which is no longer there, was located in that area. And then you have a second wave of development that comes in the 1940s to 1970s. And so because of that later development, you have some early houses that are there, but then you also have a lot of infill development in that community. Okay, so Eva Road is a really interesting example of a road that, has a lot of large farms on it, but then it becomes this kind of entertainment road that you could go to. So it was, had residential units on it, and then you get the auto-oriented era that comes in. And there's the development of Fry's Lake and the roller rink there, which you can see where you see CA 1700. That's that area where the roller rink was, and still is. And there was a lake there. It was a really popular area, and there were 2 drive-in movie theaters there. So people were coming out to that area to really have fun. It was quite the attraction. And so these are some of the ads that would come out, all for the family, come out. They would gradually develop more and more attractions at Fry's Lake. There was, swimming, diving, miniature golf, all the things that you could want in an afternoon's pastime. So it was quite the hop-in place. So returning to some of the mills, Gibson Mill Village is 1900 to 1940 kind of construction span. The mill was incorporated in 1899 with Cannon being the lead of that, of course, but was named after Robert Gibson, who's the Secretary of Treasurer at that time, who was working for the mill. It was constructed in stages. From 1900 to 1924. There's a baseball field that shows up in 1904, so we're getting some recreation in there as well, because, of course, we know how important baseball is. And then by the 1930s, you've got 97 houses in the area. So this is, again, one of those ones that was study listed. I'm trying to see if everything holds up, or the neighborhood's still there, the house is still there, and it's like, yeah, it's all still there. There's been some changes over time, but it still meets those requirements and stands up to those tests and those metrics that we look at as far as historic districts go. And so one of the other things, of course, with Gibson is that you have another commercial area that's part of that, and that's, again, something that's very important to the kind of distinctive quality of what remains in Concord. So that was one of those ones that, we're looking at as far as, yes, this should go on and be a National Register listed historic district and move forward. So we have Highland Park, which is another one of these old Charlotte Road communities. Now, the part that's to the west, kind of that dogleg part, that developed really differently. So even though that's part of the original plat, not really part of the historic core of that community, just to give you an idea. And you can see it's pretty much all fields in that area at the time of this aerial, which is it's 1938 for this aerial. But there's a lot of development to the northeast. And they really wanted to get these lots sold. So they were advertising hot air balloon rides. You could get a Christmas turkey if you got there on time. They were trying to make sure that people were incentivized to come out and get these lots. And this is part of that era of really significant growth in the early 1900s. It was fully developed pretty much by 1950. And this is one of those ones that, of course, includes churches and community buildings and things like that as well, kind of at a limited scale that services that area. So we get some bleed over from other neighboring mill housing and things like that. So, these boundaries with a closer look might flux a little bit, but that's really responding to the platted conditions of what we looked at historically. Yes? Some of the streets. So you've got, sorry, I don't have a pointer, but if you look, Highland Avenue is towards the bottom. And then if you look, Old Charlotte Road, oh, that's not showing up, sorry. Old Charlotte Road is going to be going northeast. Does that help orient at all, or no?
That's the Y between Old Charlotte and Robert.
And Robert?
Robert. Right. That's where Robert's store is today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Jackson Train
is on out like
right.
Down. Yeah. South. Yeah.
Well, bottom line.
Yeah.
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 So downtown Concord is upper right corner. Straight up.
Does that clarify at all, or?
Okay.
You sure?
Well, I in a lot of these cases, I think it'd be good if you could point out a main street.
A main street. Okay.
Or an intersection.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Of course. So. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So the path of Old Charlotte Road, where it lies with Roberta, is right in the center of that. And so Old Charlotte Road then is the one that's going straight down towards Jackson Training in the middle of the image. Does that help? Okay. Yeah, of course.
You had pulled up a slide that said Brown, I think it was, you said the Brown community.
Brown Farm, yeah.
That was part of Charlotte Road also?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so that, now I know where we're talking about.
Okay.
Because it was basically two parts of Old Charlotte Road.
Right.
Where the light is at now, that's a different part.
Yes, ma'am.
And down below that is where the African American community is at. So
yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah, I apologize, and please stop me if something is unclear, because I know this is a lot of maps and data and stuff. So, yeah. So continuing on this, like the area of Old Charlotte Road, you got the Jackson Park, Whitehall, Forest areas that were all kind of platted around the same time and kind of get squished together a little bit. But these were neighborhoods that, sometimes we're borrowing names from schools or institutions in the area. So Jackson Park, obviously from the Jackson training area. And then Whitehall was a former school in the area as well that was pretty prominent in that area. It was originally a log structure that then was converted into, a kind of fairly large for that time school. And there were grocery stores and other amenities located along Charlotte Road. But there has been so much growth and development at this time that, of course, the Whitehall School is not there anymore. And some of this built out over such a long period of time that there's not a concentration of buildings that really relate to that kind of early phase of development in this area that remains intact for what we're looking at as far as historic district, eligibility. So. And so that brings me to Logan. This is the last neighborhood in the series because I know it's been a lot of maps. Logan is one of the ones that we looked really closely at. I spent a lot of time in Logan. Spent a lot of time driving around, looking at it, making sure that I understood the history of the different areas of Logan. The development period is roughly from 1900 to 1970-ish. We cut it off because the 50-year mark is what we look at for National Register eligibility, so 50 years or older. There's some special cases that you can look at for younger than 50 years, but in general, 50 years is a benchmark that we use. The land was purchased by Warren C. Coleman. Of course, many of you know this story, in the mid-1870s, and it was called Coburg. And then, of course, as this area develops, you get Scotia Seminary, critically important institution to the development of the area and the African American community. Concord Colored School opens with Reverend Frank Logan, of course, pillar of the community, and then moves to a larger site in 1924. There's business districts and community buildings that flourish in this area. This is a very important part of Concord and of the African American community. Libraries, churches, Masonic temples, you name it, movie theaters, it was there. And one of the other things that was so important is that you have a lot of the early residences that are still intact, even though there's been demolitions, and many people shared with me some of the buildings that have been lost over time. Even though there's been those demolitions in Logan, there's still the quantity there that's necessary for National Register nomination, in my opinion, as a consultant. So this was something that I recommended to be moved forward as far as National Register consideration. And to really look closely at this community. And then some of the other documents that we were looking at, this is an early plat of Coburg that's available in the city records. And then also a later, and unfortunately they had drawn topography over this aerial, but a later view of Logan to give you an idea of just how densely developed it was and how significant of a community that it was, and continues to be. So that was one of the things that we really tried to make sure and look at. And of course, the Logan's really strong connection to the area known as Sidestown and Shankletown. We looked very closely at that, at the busing that occurred, and all of the things that are revolved around, the education for African American students, and then some of the really important changes that happened, of course, during the period of integration in 1969. And then we also looked at Silver Hill. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of change in Silver Hill, but there's still some important connections there as well, and development that could be recognized at the local level, and that was really encouraged. So that's, in summary, some of the breadth of neighborhoods that we covered. Now, that's, of course, not by any means all of them, but it gives you an idea of what we were doing, looking at, trying to make sure that that was part of the record. So recommendations, done all this stuff, looking around, looked at all these different neighborhoods. So what's next? So the districts that we recommended are listed behind me. So you've got the ones that were already study listed, but then you've got ones that are newly surveyed that we recommended to be considered as National Register Historic Districts potentially. So the ones that were study listed we kind of already went through, but there's some of the Cannon, Mill Housing, Gibson, Brown, some expansions for North Union Street, and then, of course, there's a mill district around the Adele, Locke, Randolph Mill as well. Then the newly surveyed bits, we were looking at Beverly Hills, that Coleman, Franklin, Cannon, Mill Village that I discussed earlier, Highland Park, Logan, Sidestown, Shankletown, Underwood Park, and then West Concord and Young Hartselle Mill Village, and then Wilmar Park is a really, really good example of a mid-20th century neighborhood that still has a lot of both residences and associated community structures intact, like the church and things like that. So then we have local recognition, right, as another level of looking at what could be recognized locally through signage or other means available. And so the neighborhoods are listed there for you to look at, but then also there were some individual properties that we recommended out of this whole survey. There were 30 of them total, so I don't list them all here. If you want the list, all you got to do is let us know. It's also in the report. But, excuse me, some of the ones that were highlights, pardon me, were Ships, Fire Extinguisher Service and Shops, that little core right there, Boxwood Manor House, the Armory, the Beverly Hills Elementary School, the Gibson Mills Shops, that commercial core that I noted. E.L. Morrison Lumber Company has been around for quite some time and still has some really interesting history to share. And then, of course, the Old Charlotte Road service stations that I've kind of danced around and talked about in different bits and pieces as we looked at neighborhoods surrounding the Old Charlotte Road corridor. And then there's these things called multiple property submissions that you can look at as well for kind of National Register recognition. And that's based on themes. And it kind of collects a bunch of properties that maybe are all over the place, but are thematically related and tell a story. And so some of the ones that we looked at and recommended were auto service stations, because there's enough to probably have a multiple property submission there. African-American churches and the role that they played within the community. Recreational fields, baseball fields, things like that, really, really important. Mill-related commercial districts that I've talked about. And then as another, there's a lot of historic airfields in the area. And it wasn't something that I necessarily dove into deeply with the survey part, but there's a lot of them that are still extant, and there's a story to be told there as well. So, and then additional studies and programs that we recommended as well. So one of the things at looking at all of these mill villages is realizing that there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of different pieces moving back and forth. And so developing a historic context, essentially a narrative of what was going on when for historic mills, became increasingly an important part of both what I was trying to piece together, but something that I think would be really beneficial moving forward as the community begins to talk more about these overarching themes and stories and things like that. One of the things that's used really commonly is interpretive signage as a way to have the public engage in place and mark where things happened and events, people, sites, history, all of those things can be done in interpretive signage in a program that way. Heritage tourism is one way to also engage with this history, brochures, events, things of that nature. Walking tours, some of that. And I know some of those things are already going on, but, taking the study and then folding that into something that's more publicly available and publicly accessible is something that, to me, is a really exciting opportunity. And then we have the tax incentive program. So one of the things with, National Register nomination recognition is that you have these federal tax credit programs that you can engage with to receive credits for when you're developing properties or rehabbing properties. And I'm happy to talk more about that program if any of you are interested individually to speak about that. One of the things that we also found was that there's a really wonderful opportunity in the community to capture more oral histories of people, currently, their memories, the things that they remember, for example, about Logan, the things that they remember about, Sciencestown and Shankletown, the ways that people, remember about what the mill villages used to look like. All of these things are, people remember this stuff, and I think it's a really wonderful moment to try to capture that and to have an organized program surrounding that that could be, incorporated into either, high school or college curricula or, internships. There's all kinds of ways to structure that program that I've seen done in different communities, and I think that would be a really exciting thing to have happen here. And then the other thing is the expansion and updates to current listed properties, National Register listed properties. And the prominent one is Barbara Scotia College. The buildings that are on the back side of that campus are now 50 years of age, and so the boundary for that district doesn't include those. And so in order to capture that really important history that happened later, it was my recommendation to relook at those boundaries and re-engage with that history and to potentially look at that again. So that was one of the many recommendations that came out of that particular phase of recommendations and programming that we looked at. So I know that's been a lot of information. So I want to open it up to questions now. Yes, sir.
In that survey, I noticed that you didn't hear anything about cemeteries.
Yes, sir.
Are they protected under a different?
So cemeteries can be part of survey, but because of the focus of the study being on neighborhoods and buildings, we didn't necessarily focus on that, especially within this talk. But it is a recommendation to go back and look at cemeteries more, because that is something that, of course, is really important. And my colleagues that work in archaeology, of course, are looking at cemeteries all the time, and then I can kind of make recommendations about the above ground stuff and looking at walls and headstones and things like that. But yeah, it was something that is definitely acknowledged as being an important study that needs to happen, but not necessarily part of this body of work at this time.
Moves from being registered.
Yeah. That depends on review with the state, because you have to re-engage with where that study list was left off, how old it is, and then work with the state to figure it out. I mean, I've seen them go, like a year, but that don't hold me to that. It just depends on how long it's been since it was looked at, and then working with the state to then, of course, update everything. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
The property that I saw on the Brownville side, those slides,
Yes, sir.
connect some other places, so is it possible that Brownville could be registered in the neighborhood right next to it, may not be for another year?
I mean, it's possible for things to go in phases where you get that disjoint, yeah, where you would have something, like a one part of an area listed because that historically is, one story, and then you have another part that's, say, a slightly different story that they decide, well, that's actually significantly different enough that should be its own district, and so then that would be potentially like a later phase.
So the people who are in opposition of becoming on the registered list of developers who want to come and build something big can block it?
I mean, you have to have local buy-in for, National Register, I will say, National Register historic districts are honorific, period. But, pardon? I mean, yes, if they're on the study list and you want to move forward, and there's we always have to factor in community opposition. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Was the question if you want to construct something in a national register district?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't.
Was that the question? Was the question, were you asking if it were a national register district, if you wanted to build something in that location?
No, if they're just on the study list.
On the study list, either way, if you wanted to build something in that location?
Yeah.
As you said, national register districts are just honorary, which means it gives their blessing to say this place deserves recognition. It does not mean the city of Concord has a zoning regulation over whether something is built with knowledge. Just status and recognition that that place is.
Which means you could tear it down and just put them on.
That's correct.
Yes,
That's
sir.
correct.
Yeah. Sorry, I apologize for misunderstanding. Any other questions? No. Well, if you think of anything else, I am happy to answer any questions that any of you may have later on. I really encourage you to go through and read the document, and I'm happy to talk to any of you. I have business cards up here as well. So again, I want to thank you for your time, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. If any of you after this are looking for the architectural survey that she's prepared and the rest of the status of the preservation planning process, our website is concordnc.gov/preservation plan. The entire document's available for review and comment there. And it'll also be our hub for any updates as the project progresses. So thank you all so much for coming today. Really appreciate your interest in this project and the history of our community, and hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon.